All right, guys, let's start talking about ecology. So if we break the word down, eco means house. And when you guys think about your house, well, what are the things that are inside your house? You're going to have all your living things like you or pets or plants, whatever you keep living in your house. And then you also have all the non-living parts like your furniture and your furniture essentially is what you keep that's not living in your house. And then ology is the study of. So ecology, by definition, is the study, because living is biotic, that's where bio comes from. And don't forget A means not, and bio, that's life, so not living. So ecology is the study of my biotic and abiotic factors in an area, because that's where your house is. Your house is in an area. And so we look at the relationship between the living and the non-living parts within that area. And that's all ecology is we're going to study all the living things and then how they interact with their environment. That's where ecology comes from. Now, ecology, we always start off with the basis. We start off with the levels of organization. And these are our basic levels. So we start with our smallest right here. Our smallest level is an organism. All right. Now, an organism is one single living thing. That's why right here I have a fish. He is one single living thing. Then, if I put one or more of the same living thing in an area, that's where I get a population. Now, remember, when you have a single living thing or multiple of the same living thing, and they can breed and have viable offspring, that's what a species is. So remember, a species is when you have a group of organisms that can reproduce and they can make viable offspring or offspring that aren't sterile. Okay, so that's what a species is. So I start with an organism, and then when I have multiple of my organisms, so 6, so now I have several fish here. Now I have a population. Well, when you have one or more populations in an area, that's when you get a community. So I have my few fish right here. I also have a crab now, and I have this aquatic plant. So I have a community. I have one or more populations in the same area. Then when I take that community and I put them with all their abiotic factors, that's when I get an ecosystem. So 6. So I still have my fish, I have my crab, I have my aquatic plant, but now I put abiotic stuff. Like I have all my sand down here, right? And I have a rock right here. And then I have the water that these guys are living in, and I have the sunlight. That makes up an ecosystem because I have my living and the non-living components in an area, and they interact with each other. Now, where these ecosystems are, that's what we call a biome. Remember, a biome is a distinct region with distinct weather patterns. So we can think about like savanna or tundra. This particular one that I drew with all the water, maybe that is a marine or a saltwater biome. And then your biomes are located on your biosphere, and that's all the livable portions of Earth. So that's our levels of organization. I start off with my single living thing, and I work all the way up to my Earth, or the livable portions. Now, our organisms, we talk about ecosystems and biomes and biosphere. When we talk about a particular organism, we always refer to them in their habitat. Now, a habitat, by definition, is where my organism lives. Okay, it's where he lives. And then, where my organism lives, this is going to determine what his niche or his niche is. That's his role in a food chain. It's his job, okay? Now, his job is usually what we would consider all these different feeding relationships, like a herbivore. Herbivores, we know that they eat plants, but that would be like a rabbit's job in his ecosystem is to eat the plants. Or you have a carnivore. Carnivores eat meat. That could be the coyote's job in his habitat. He's supposed to eat the rabbits, so that way he keeps the populations down. And then I have omnivores. Omnivores eat both plants and animals, so maybe like a bear, right? Like that's his job. His job is to eat both of those things. And then a detrivore, he eats dead and decaying matter. That'd be like a worm or fungi. Say they break down that organic matter so that way the plants can take it back up and use it for nutrients so they can grow up big and strong. But that's what a niche is. A niche is your job, and your job is usually the feeding relationship that you have within your habitat. And now that we've talked about feeding relationships, we can go on to food chains. Now remember, a food chain is a linear pathway that shows a transfer of energy. That's really all a food chain is. So I look at this really simple food chain. Like right here, I started with plants. Okay? Now plants, we can call them a couple different names. They can either be a producer because they produce their own food through photosynthesis, or they can be an autotroph. Auto means self, troph is feeding. So these are self-feeding organisms, again, by doing photosynthesis. And then who's going to eat my plants? Well, that's going to be my mouse, right? Because there's the start of my food chain. I have plants. Plants get their energy from the sunlight. And then when the plants grow, then maybe this guy can eat them. Well, if you are eating something, you're referred to as a consumer because you're consuming your food. And since he's the first consumer in this food chain, he's called the primary consumer. We can also write that as a 1 with a 0. He's a primary consumer. And then following the food chain, we'll have this cat. He's going to eat the mouse, and so he would be a secondary consumer. But that's a really simple food chain. It shows the linear pathway of the transfer of energy because this plant is going to give his energy to the mouse, and then that mouse is going to give his energy to the cat. Okay? So when we're talking about energy, right, the most energy you can have in a food chain is always going to be located down at your producer or your autotroph level because that's where 100% of the energy is going to start. Also, if you look at my awesome triangle that I drew around them, this is also the biggest part of my triangle, is down here at the bottom with my plants or my producers. And then as I go up my food chain, you can see my triangle gets smaller. So consumers have a little less energy, and then secondary consumers have even less. And then if we had made another one, a tertiary one, then they'd even have the least amount of energy. Okay, so as I go up my food chain, I lose energy. Okay, now when we talk about energy numbers, I only get to transfer 10%. So if I had 100% energy down here at plants, then they only get to give 10% of their energy to my primary consumers, which means they can only give 1% of their energy to the secondary consumers. And if I'd had a tertiary up here, then they'd only get 0.1%. So I lose energy as I go up my food chain. Usually the other 90%, that's lost as heat and work and that kind of stuff. All right, we can also use my pretty triangle to talk about biomass, right? Now, biomass definition is the amount of living, because bio, living, and don't forget living has carbon in it, so it's organic, living organic matter in an area. And if we look at my triangle, we can see that the plants have the biggest part, right? So they have the most biomass. And then as I go up my food chain, I lose biomass. But that would make sense because if you look at the area around you, like your living room or your classroom, you could probably say, oh, that would fit 10 million blades of grass. All right, so that's a lot of biomass. But those 10 million blades of grass can't support 10 million mice. Maybe that can only support 100 mice. And then those 100 mice may only be able to support 2 cats. And so my biomass, that amount of organic matter, that's lost as I go up each step. And these steps of a food chain actually have a fancy name. These are called a trophic level. So each step in a food chain is called a trophic level. So my producer, my primary consumer, my secondary consumer, my tertiary consumer, these are all considered trophic levels. Trophic level is just a step in a food chain. And so now that we've covered a food chain, we can talk about food webs. Food webs, instead of showing a linear pathway, they can show all the pathways of energy in an area, right? So I didn't want to draw all the pretty pictures, but we can see here's my plant, and then I have crickets and mice and hawks. Well, if I follow one food chain, plant to mouse, so plant was my producer, and then my mouse, he would be my primary consumer. And then the mouse feeds the hawk, that would be my secondary consumer. But if I follow another pathway, my plant was my producer, and then the crickets eat the plant, he's my second primary consumer, sorry. And then my mouse eats the cricket, now he's a secondary consumer, and now my hawk would be a tertiary consumer. So when we start looking at food webs, you can be in more than one trophic level, but only one at a time, right? So if my mouse was eating the plant, he also cannot be eating the cricket at the same time. So he can only do one job at a time. It's really easy to understand, like if you say, okay, I'm your teacher, right? But I'm also a mother, I'm also a wife. And so if I'm in the middle of class teaching and my son walks in, I don't get to be teacher anymore. Now I have to be mom. So I can be both of those. I can be a teacher and I can also be a mom. I can also be a wife. I just can't do them at the exact same time. And that's how trophic levels work. I can be in multiple trophic levels, but I can only do one of them at a time. Then, to round all this out, when we talk about food webs and all the organisms inside, we can kind of jump back to biodiversity. Don't forget, biodiversity is referred to as the number of species in an area. And then as biodiversity increases, so the more number of species I have, then the impact of disease is less. And that's just because I have so many different organisms there that I probably have organisms that aren't susceptible to the disease, and so the impact is less. But as biodiversity decreases, then the impact of the disease increases because I have less diversity, and so if it impacts one, it's going to impact a lot of them. But there you go, that's the starting of ecology. So we have the word, we have the levels of organization, we have habitat versus niche, we have different feeding relationships, food chains show a linear pathway within the trophic levels, and then the food web will show all the pathways of energy. All right, hope that helps.